Hello. Hello, hello. So, like just now, when I have forgotten to set up a Zoom meeting or I canceled them all when I thought we were going to be outside, do you get a notification when I send one out? Okay, good. Thank you. It looks like we would have been on Zoom today anyway because it's so cold. So we'll wait for everybody to come in. We'll give everybody a few minutes since I was late with the link. Okay, great. So welcome back. It's nice to see you all. I hope that you are feeling well. Those of you who are in quarantine, I hope you are on the mend. I'm going to start today. We have 2 TED Talks. I have not forgotten that we have 2 TED Talks. But what I want to do is give us an introduction to the international style before we get into the specificity of the TED Talks. We're waiting for one more presenter to show up, in fact. Alex, if I do that, does that throw you off? Okay, great. So let's get back in the groove of this again. And then as people roll in, they'll just pick up from where we are. Okay, today we are looking at the international style. You've already had glimpses of the international style in several of the modules that we've created. And as mentioned, for those of you just now popping in, I'm going to start with the lecture and we will intersperse or finish with the TED Talks. I have not forgotten them. So the international style arises around the 1920s and the 1930s. It overlaps a bit and picks up where Art Deco left off. And you'll see some continuity and some dramatic differences. So our class goals today, we are going to look at the myth and the makeup of what's called the international style. The material study here would primarily be steel, as that's what makes most of these structures possible. And we'll look at more case studies than the Domino House, but we'll begin with the Domino House. We will look at some work by both Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer in a slightly different context than the way we talked about his work in Brasilia. So to get started, what I'd like to do is put you into breakout rooms. You might want to take a screen grab of this set of instructions because once I zero out, they'll be gone. They're very simple. What you're going to do in your breakout rooms is make a list of the materials and techniques you would use to create a new building on Wake's campus. And you want that building to be in keeping with the rest of the school's architecture. Then draw the entrance and the facade for that new building. That can be all one drawing, but just make sure you're drawing the facade, the primary facade. Okay, let me get us out of here and put you into breakout rooms. And we'll do that for about 5 to 7 minutes. All right. See you shortly. For those of you who are watching this asynchronously, your task is the same. Create a list, and you can do this individually. Of course, you don't need to get together in groups. Create a list of the materials and the architectural techniques you would employ to build a new building on Wake Forest campus. You want it to be in keeping with the style of the rest of the campus. So it's not a time to do something totally new. Then after you've done that, create a drawing of the facade that includes the entrance. And you can either email those to me or post them in Slack, whatever works for you. Hello, hello. All right. How did it go? What did you come up with?
We talked about how it would probably be a brick building with like a copper roof.
Yes.
And probably have like a gable style roof, and on the bottom most part of the triangle have the name of the building, most likely after someone who paid for it.
Great, great, good. Spot on. What else? Anybody else have any other details? Yes, Emily.
I also said that some of the buildings like might have columns on them.
Yep.
And above the entrance main doors, there might be like a half circle window. So you see that a lot with like the academic buildings.
Yep. Excellent. Good. Anything else? Any other components? Hannah.
We also put on our building, like, I think there's at least in Ronaldo, I know there's kind of like a iron fence or something up on that second floor. So we tried to incorporate something like that.
Yep.
And then, yeah, we also tried to do like the columns and things like that. I think it ended up just kind of looking like Ronaldo, but you know.
Good. Elena, you had a point as well.
Yeah, I was going to say like the off-white concrete kind of coloring, and also some chimneys and a lot of windows.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Anything else? Anybody else? No. So if you were an architect commissioned tomorrow, your task would be pretty straightforward, right? Your things aren't going to wildly diverge from what's already on campus. They could. We have an example of that. We have 2 examples of that. The backside of Farrell Hall, for example, radically deviates from the style markers of Wake's campus, and Scales plays with those, pushes on those in a way that keeps the familiarity of that brick and then pushes a little further. And as some of you have mentioned, in fact, are any of you on here right now who've written about where that brick comes from? Or at least what it's called? Okay, it's a Virginia style brick and it comes from Virginia. So we have kind of a tie to close proximity. We have a set of style, a set of techniques, a set of ways that this thing is going to go together. And what we're going to get into exactly what that means to look at the buildings around you and replicate them again and again. And we're going to do that by thinking through where we've gone in the course so far. So let me share my screen with you again. Okay. These images should all be quite familiar to you by now. We have looked at mud and earthen architecture in places like Mali and West Africa. We have looked at brick in Uruguay. We've looked at wooden construction, both in Japan, China as well, briefly, and of course, Northern Russia. We have looked at stone, particularly in the Chthonic architecture of Petra and surrounding areas. And we've looked at stone and its use in ancient Rome, just to name a few sites where we've looked at, through the course, we've looked at architecture through the lens of architecture in the Anthropocene, right? Thinking about what humans make using the materials around them. There's another name for this, and it's called vernacular architecture. Have any of you heard this term before? Let me get to where I can see all of you. Anybody? Okay, so vernacular architecture is this. It emerges from the convergence of local materials and building techniques. It can also be called regional architecture. So what I've had you do just now with your example with Wake is hyper-local and hyper-regional. And while that style does extend across, let's say, Winston-Salem and other parts, we see a lot of this Georgian and Jeffersonian architecture. What you're really detailing is campus architecture, which takes its cue from Thomas Jefferson and his ideal for what a campus should look like. So it's a very hyper-local, vernacular in a particularized sense. But when we think about most of the architecture we've looked at so far, that by definition is vernacular architecture. But of course, the people who made it didn't call it vernacular architecture. They called it building, right? They called it construction. You don't come up with a term that describes this thing until there's something opposite, until something different emerges that you can juxtapose to vernacular architecture. So today we're focusing in on the emergence of that other option. We looked at these images when we saw the skyscraper in the park module, and we talked about how this very Gothic sort of tracery and embellishment and ornament was showing up on skyscrapers. And then sometimes you get Art Deco on skyscrapers, and sometimes you get who knows what on skyscrapers. And in the 1920s and 30s, a set of architects, particularly from Northern Europe, but it also sort of moved over into the United States, started to say no to this kind of eclecticism. Once what was originally vernacular architecture, something particular to a region, given the materials, training, and background, became like a style you could pick from, as if you were, pulling clothing from a shelf to pick what you'd like to wear that day. Many architects put their foot down and said, no, this has nothing to do with your culture and background. You're just picking these things at random in a way that they don't embody, they don't say anything about who you are or the place where this is being built. That's the stance they took, and they took it very strongly, which is bizarre as we get into what the tenets of their movement was called. And that style, that opposition to both regionalism and eclecticism, is called the international style. just from the name itself, what would you guess? What does that mean? What's an international style going to look like?
I would guess it'd be a very standardized set of rules that you could like put into any city or any like place.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter like what materials you had.
Nice. Great. Emily, you also had a comment.
Oh, I don't know if this is right. I was gonna say that it's like not uniform then. So you can have just like a bunch of different types of buildings. So it would kind of look like mismatched almost.
Yeah, so more like eclecticism, just sort of like a little bit of everything representing everyone. Okay, it is more toward what Luke's describing by leaps and bounds, but it's not intuitive that that's the direction they would go. It makes perfect sense, and especially from our position in history today, Emily, to be thinking about it the way that you are. But these international style architects, originally this was just called modernism. It was a group of modern architects who saw themselves at the forefront of thinking as part of this push to make the architecture an embodiment of the ideas of the time, right? This ongoing idea that we looked at very early on from Mies van der Rohe, that the will of the epoch is given form in architecture. Okay, who came up with this thing? During the 1920s and 30s, this idea was brewing that in order to defeat the regionalism, nationalism, and other very insular outlooks that gave rise to World War I and then hit its peak in World War II, something universal, something global, something that united all of humanity would need to rise to the fore. That was the thinking for the lofty ones anyway. The name, the international style, emerged from the very first architecture exhibition at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was curated by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson in 1932. The exhibition itself was called Modern Architecture International Exhibition, but as the curators and critics wrote about it, the name of this type of work that they showed at this exhibition came to be called the international style. It was born from a set of ideas, even an ideology, as to what architecture in the 20th century should look like. And its visual cues really leaned hard on the function of the building. So this image should be familiar to you. It is part of our section on Brasilia. What is it that we're looking at in those structures rising up in the background? What is that? Yep, Alex.
Maybe the idea behind having all the similar buildings was to kind of unify people like you were talking about during the era where there was divisions. And although in the end it did recreate those divisions by like separating different class structures,
Yeah.
I think the intended purpose was probably to unify people and have everyone feel like they had the same access to the same styles and architectural buildings.
Yes, absolutely. Again, within that tier of everyone, excluding the majority of the population, but in their mind, everyone would have access. Yes, absolutely. Okay, good. Technically or structurally, what are we looking at back there? Let's see. Yeah, Emily.
Sorry again. Post and lintel system.
Post and lintel, 100%. Good work. Good. What else? Let's see, Jack, Olivia, or Josh.
We're looking at the copy and paste kind of technique that we talked about earlier, and also just a uniform set of floors within one building.
Yes. How are those floor? How is that architecture happening? It's post and lintel. What's it made out of?
Probably using concrete and steel.
Yep, concrete and steel. And you can see that it almost looks like a set of units, you know, like one stacked on the next, stacked on the next, they're identical all the way up, right? Great. Now we see buildings that go up that way all the time. It's nothing. Yes, Wenxin, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say that when thinking about making a building, I would say like you start a building and then you finish it and then you start another one. But for those three buildings, they're kind of built on an assembly line where none of them is finished, but they're at the same progress.
Yes, absolutely important observation, right? They've done one format across the board for multiple buildings. They've created one set of structures, one set of what we're going to call skeletons or endoskeletons for the building, and then they'll go on and do the next step to all the buildings all over again. Great. Okay. As in all the ways that you've mentioned, we have the makings of the international style in these buildings without even seeing what's going to happen next. We know from the platforms, the post and lintel, the steel and concrete, this reproducibility, we're already almost all the way there. There is more to an international style building than just its interior. And I want to look at that through one of its exemplars. We're going to think about it, the international style for a moment through the work of Le Corbusier. And Luke is going to go into this for us later in the class, but I want to give you an overview of what Corbu is up to. So hopefully, well, one of you just let me know right away if the voice and the image are not in sync. And if they're not, I prefer that you watch it on your own computer. I'll give you the link and then we'll come back. So, okay, here we go.
If the idea of being a modern person and leading a modern life still has an exciting ring to it, it's at least in part down to the influence of an extraordinary Swiss architect, Le Corbusier, who in the first half of the 20th century wrote books, put up buildings, and designed bits of furniture that all conveyed the excitement, sleekness, and glamour of the modern technological world. Le Corbusier began his career by attacking the architecture of the Victorian age and contrasting it with what he saw as the beauty and intelligence of modern engineering. Our engineers are healthy and virile, active and useful, balanced and happy in their work, he exclaimed in his famous polemical book, Towards a New Architecture, written in 1923. Meanwhile, Le Corbusier added, our architects are disillusioned and unemployed, boastful or peevish. This is because there will soon be nothing for them to do. We no longer have the money to erect historical souvenirs. At the same time, everyone needs to wash. Our engineers provide for these things, and they will be our builders. Le Corbusier recommended that the houses of the future be ascetic and clean, disciplined and frugal. His hatred of any kind of decoration extended to a pity of the British royal family and the ornate golden carriage in which they travelled to open Parliament in every year. He suggested that they push the carved monstrosity off the cliffs of Dover and instead learn to travel around their kingdom in a Hispano-Suiza 1911 racing car. He even mocked Rome, the traditional destination for the education of young architects, and renamed it the City of Horrors, the damnation of the half-educated, and the cancer of French architecture, on account of its violation of modern principles of architecture through all its Baroque detailing, elaborate wall painting, and statuary. For Le Corbusier, true great architecture, meaning architecture motivated by the quest for modern efficiency, was more likely to be found in an electricity turbine or a low-pressure ventilating fan. It was to these machines that his books accorded the reverential photographs which previous architectural writers had reserved for cathedrals and opera houses. Once asked by a magazine editor to name his favorite chair, Le Corbusier cited the seat of a cockpit and described the first time he ever saw an aeroplane in the spring of 1909 in the sky above Paris. It was the aviator, the Comte de Lambert, taking a turn around the Eiffel Tower as the most significant moment of his life. He observed that the requirements of flight of necessity rid aeroplanes of all the superfluous decoration of buildings, and so unwittingly transforms them into successful pieces of modern architecture. To place a classical statue on top of a house was for Le Corbusier as silly as to add one to a plane, but at least by crashing in response to this addition, the plane had the advantage of rendering the absurdity starkly manifest. L'avion accuse, he concluded. But if the function of a plane was to fly, what was the function of a house? Le Corbusier arrived at a simple list of requirements, beyond which all other ambitions were no more than, as he put it, romantic cobwebs. The function of a house was to provide 1. A shelter against heat, cold, rain, thieves, and the inquisitive. 2. A receptacle for light and sun. 3. A certain number of cells appropriated to cooking, work, and personal life. What modern man wants is a monk's cell, well lit and heated, with a corner from which he can look at the stars, wrote Le Corbusier. His private houses, which he built in and around Paris in the 1920s and 30s, were unlike anything that people had ever witnessed, both inside and out. Le Corbusier took an interest in their smallest details, always with an eye to increasing efficiency. He built much of the furniture himself and was often to earn more money from it than from his architecture. Le Corbusier was evidently one of the world's greatest architects, but he was also one of the world's most disastrous urban designers. His manifesto on how to make cities, contained in 2 books, The City of Tomorrow and Its Planning, written in 1925, and The Radiant City of 1933, called for a dramatic break from the past. The existing city centers must all come down. To save itself, every great city must rebuild its center. Le Corbusier wanted ever taller towers, some housing as many as 40,000 people. When he visited New York for the first time, he came away disappointed by the relatively small scale of the buildings. "Your skyscrapers are too low," he told a surprised journalist. By building upwards, 2 problems would be resolved at a stroke: overcrowding and urban sprawl. Le Corbusier planned to abolish city streets. In his vision of the future, people would have footpaths all to themselves, while cars would enjoy massive, dedicated motorways with smooth, curving interchanges. Even more than Paris, New York was for Le Corbusier the epitome of an illogical city because it had managed to graft skyscrapers, the buildings of the future, onto a tight street plan better suited to a medieval settlement. On his trip around the United States, he advised his increasingly bemused American hosts that Manhattan ought to be demolished to make way for a fresh and more Cartesian attempt at urban design. Ironically, what Le Corbusier's dreams helped to generate were the dystopian housing estates that now ring historic Paris, the wastelands from which tourists avert their eyes in confused horror and disbelief on their way into the historic city. To take an overland train to the most violent and degraded of these places is to realize all that Le Corbusier forgot about architecture, and in a wider sense about human nature. For example, he forgot how tricky it is when just a few of one's 2,699 neighbors decide to throw a party or buy a handgun. He forgot how drab reinforced concrete can seem under a grey sky. He forgot how awkward it is when someone lights a fire in the lift shaft and home is on the 44th floor. When Le Corbusier died in 1965, having had a heart attack in the south of France, where he'd gone for a swim, he was responsible for having built some of the most beautiful private houses of all time. But his ideas had also destroyed some of the great cities of Europe and the United States. For a man whose ambition was to change the world, we can revere him paradoxically for the most modest things about him: his beautiful whitewashed villas, his door handles, and his armchairs.
Okay. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms once again. This time, go through. Oops, I moved too fast before I got rid of the slide. Okay, what are the objects or entities that Le Corbusier hates or thinks are the enemy of modern architecture? And what are the objects or entities that he loves and thinks architecture should be based on? Got it? Okay. All right, see you in a bit. For those of you doing this async, I will post the link to the video in the announcements. If you want to look it up without getting outside of here, you can go to YouTube and Google the School of Life, Le Corbusier. It's a complicated French name, but that'll get you there, and I'll also post the link. And then individually, once again, if you will write a list after watching that video of the things Le Corbusier hated and thought should be eradicated and never part of architecture, and the things that he adored and thought should really drive the way architecture and cities were built and planned.
Oh, we talked about how he basically assumed every single individual has the same need in their life. And it just kind of reminds me of those like really economic motive dedicated building in Soviet Union when they were building those massive apartments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The idea that everyone has the same needs. We'll go into that. Perfect segue. Thank you for that. But there are also some amazing, crazy things, right? Like his real hatred for that carriage that carried the Queen in England. I'm just suggesting to throw it off the cliff. Like, okay, all right, it's dramatic. And the love of the cockpit and those turbines and all of this sort of mechanical precision organization. You see where he's going, right? Okay. Let me share my screen again. All right, one of Le Corbusier's most iconic creations is a structure that wasn't actually ever built on its own. It is called the Domino House, or the Maison Domino, and it's a play on words. The idea comes from a couple of things. One, the shape, if you looked at the shape of these floors in plan, they have a similar set of dimensions as a domino would have, right? Their scale and relationship of length and width. So that's part of the domino idea. You could also set those, he's sort of setting those dominoes up one on top of the other as you would set up to play. But the bottom line is that in Latin, the word for house is domus, D-O-M-U-S. And so that's what he's leaning on, is this replicability and the idea that it would be a prototype for a house. So as you saw in the Brasilia example, and as you talked about, we're looking at straight up post and lintel. We're using a series of steel beams, right, to carry the weight of the building. And then we have reinforced concrete on the floors. Now, why is this a big deal? From the earliest architecture structures that we've looked at in this class, there has been a drive to create height and in that height to achieve a sort of lightness, you know, to be able to get as many windows on the structure as you can, to bring light in from the outside. And this domino house prototype model or structure creates a kind of skeleton for a building where everything structural happens within these set of features. And then anything else that happens is just candy or cake in addition to that structural action. So the components that you have are those cantilevered stairs. They're not even supported. You have very open floor plans because those steel beams can be at the edges of a given span, which he's outlined in this plan. And for Le Corbusier, this domino house, which we see actually finally built in 2014 by a very different architect as part of the Venice Biennial, it was to be the skeleton of the architectural body. And he took this analogy really seriously, that you would have a skeleton and then whatever happened next is simply the skin. It's the drapery that covers the functional structural aspects of the building. If we think about how hard Romanesque builders and architects and then Gothic builders and architects were really trying to push to get the structure of the building as minimal as possible in order to bring in more stained glass, bring in more light, Le Corbusier and many architects of the modern era saw this as like the end point of the evolution of all of these classical buildings. So this is a tattoo that many people who go into architecture get. It's just like a revered kind of structure, as simple as it looks and as common as it looks to us now. Le Corbusier didn't come up with the idea of the international style himself. He is one of many architects who are proponents of this style, and that style emerged or began to take shape in factory architecture long before it was applied to public or private homes. The Fagus factory is on the UNESCO World Heritage List because it is the earliest site where the components of the international style or the components of modernism come together. So what are we looking at? What do you see in the image here of the factory? Jack or Gabe or Josh? Yeah.
I was just gonna say it has a lot of windows on both sides of it to get a lot of light in to the area that people are going to be working in for most of the day. And I was also going to point out it has that style of squared off angles and flat roofs.
Yeah, absolutely. What else?
You can see that staircase in there too, in this like front corner here.
Nice, right over here. Great. What else? What else is going on in the building? Think of it compared to the Romanesque cathedral we examined. Any commonalities? It's a little bit of a stretch, but what happens in the Fagus building is that those buttresses, that really important structural component of conch, for example, is now, it's so unimportant that it's actually recessed. Here, Walter Gropius, the architect, is showing off modern capabilities. The buttress is no longer needed. That stained glass, which would have before been embedded at least inside a thick wall and then supported by flying buttresses, none of that is needed anymore. The structure of the building, that domino house paradigm that's being played out in this factory, is making the windows, they cannot hang at the edge of the building. It doesn't seem like anything to us now. We see it over and over again, but this was really an architectural marvel for its time in 1910. So looking at the Fagus factory, so many European architects started trying to push in this direction, trying to minimize the weight of their structures, trying to really focus on light and windows and the reduction of ornament. If we had looked at a Gothic cathedral, for example, we would have had tracery, we would have had stained glass, there would have been a lot of decorative elements that are storytelling on the building. Modernism, the international style, they're going to try to get rid of that wholesale. So Walter Gropius, the architect for the Fagus factory, is also behind the Bauhaus school. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Bauhaus style. It's really the heart of minimalism. If we think about anytime anyone says clean lines, that's coming from this style. It's an eradication of anything else other than the pure function of the building. Gropius, talking about this school itself, said, "Let us strive for, conceive, and create the building of the future that will unite every discipline." It's the idea of a total style. Not only will architecture take on a particular aesthetic, but the art that's made there, the graphic art that's made there, the typesetting, any of the work that's done by the students should all aim toward this sort of singular minimalism. So many famous architects and artists went to school here and then taught here. Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Mies van der Rohe that we've spoken about many times, Herbert Bayer and Marcel Breuer, who, if you go on to study modern architecture, you will get to know them more and more. But the Nazis, this is taking place in Germany. The Bauhaus School is in Germany, and the Nazis hated, they despised this sort of avant-garde aesthetic, which was leaving behind history, which of course was a key component toward German nationalism. It's just the opposite of that, right? Trying to get rid of nationalism, regionalism, all of that. And the Nazis came down quite hard on many of the faculty who had to flee around the world. That's how the international style first spread to the United States, Switzerland, Russia, and elsewhere, until its global appearance around the 1950s and 60s, as we saw in Brasilia and other examples. And you can see the commonalities between the Bauhaus School and that early Vegas factory, right? Okay, a few more points on the components of the international style. The drive is to emphasize the volume of a building rather than the density. So again, just like as far from the Romanesque as they could get, how can we think about a building as almost a balloon, something that has weightless volume? Instead of symmetry, like we see on a lot of Wakes buildings where you could slice the building in half, fold it, and you've got this kind of axial layout. International style architects saw that as old fashioned and instead went for regularity, or what we would just think of as repetition. And the eradication of ornamentation, decoration is absolutely essential. Some of the key quotes around this are that ornament is a crime. We'll look at that in a little more detail in a minute. Form follows function. You've probably heard this one if you've heard any of these. Truth to materials, and as Le Corbusier is famous for saying, the home is a machine for living. It's a radically different type of architecture than what we've looked at before. Okay, before I carry on too long, Luke, would you be willing to present on the Villa Savoye? All right.
Sorry, I don't know why my mute button wasn't working.
That's just fine.
All right, so today I'll be talking about the Villa Savoye. This is a building built from 1929 to 1931 by Le Corbusier. And this was basically his attempt at showing the ideal building, the ideal house, following his plan. And he basically had a 5-step program for the perfect house or villa. So here, just with other pictures of the plan and different floors of it, I'm going to go over those 5 points. The first one is that the building should be lifted over pilotis, which, if you could see my mouse, those are those little beams on the bottom. And the whole idea behind that is that the ground floor belongs to the car, to the automobile, and as such, the ground should be empty, leaving free space and movement to the car. The first floor also had a garage. It wasn't meant for anything else other than the car or green space. That was all that was there. The second rule was free designing of the ground plan, and this basically meant that there was no structural limitations. Like you didn't have to build the building a certain way in order for it to stay up. You could do whatever you wanted. This also used the pilotis as sort of like little posts all throughout the plan. And that way you could basically put whatever you wanted using however many or however few of those beams for support. And you could do unlimited amounts of designs and shapes for the first floor, or the second floor, or the third floor, or however high you want it to go. The third main point is the free facade. And then this was meant to sort of, this goes in conjunction with the fourth point, which is the horizontal window. And the whole point, he wanted the house to have equal lighting throughout the whole thing. And the best way to do that was to have a free facade. Also plays into his themes of no ornamentation. There should be no sculpture, no sketching, no murals, no painting. And then with the free facade and the singular full horizontal window, you just get equal lighting throughout. And it's very efficient, very similar. There's nothing out of the ordinary. Everything's very efficient. And then the last one, which personally is my favorite rule, would be the roof garden. And I enjoyed how Le Corbusier wanted whatever space you took from the building to be given back to nature. And he thought the best way to do that was to add greenery to the top of the building in any way possible, through trees or an actual little garden, whatever you could do. But he thought there should be something there that gave back to the earth that you took away. So speaking of Le Corbusier, or his actual name, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, he was a sort of, as we just saw, he was a visionary in his field, one of the creators of modernist architecture. And I just wanted to use this slide to talk a little bit about his theory and the way he went about things. And he described his own method as a patient search. He would wait a long time looking at lots of things, and sort of, he would look at one thing, one motif, and he would spend a lot of time changing its form and context. He wouldn't bounce around to a bunch of different things, a bunch of different influences. He would sort of find some that he enjoyed and try to make them the best he could. And to the right, my right, I don't know if it's flipped or not, but one of those instances he saw from Roman ruins he saw 40 years ago. He ended up creating this chapel at Ronchamp, I believe it's called, where the top is top lit towers, which was never done before. And he used this from a Roman ruin. Again, just out of the blue, he sort of got this idea from that, and he used that very unique and very unheard of structure in this building. And then also I included this quote here from one of my sources. If you want to read it, you can. I just thought it was very, it showed the good part of Le Corbusier and the part that people enjoyed and celebrated. And then obviously there is his criticisms and his urban planning, which didn't really end up so well. And he ended up receiving a lot of criticism, not only for that, but also his reductionism and how he brought buildings down to sort of plain and simple in some people's minds. Coming back to the Via Savoye, after World War II, or during World War II, the reason it's called La Via Savoye is because the Savoye family lived inside it, but they left during World War II. And during that time and after the war, really nothing was happening with the house. It fell into decay, it was unlivable. And really there was nothing that the French government, which now owned it, thought they could do with it. So they were going to change the building into, tear it down and use it for an educational schools for the area. But once Le Corbusier and a lot of his disciples and those who worked with him saw this, they all sort of rallied and went into action to save this building. And this last slide here sort of talks about three of those very important people. The first one, Siegfried Gideon, was Le Corbusier's friend for the longest time, and he sort of brought a lot of the fame and a lot of the recognition worldwide of La Via Savoye, publishing many journals and many articles, taking many photographs. Even when it wasn't complete, he made it look complete. And he's sort of the behind the scenes guy who made this building what it is. Once he was told by Le Corbusier that the building was going away, he immediately rushed into action, and he tried to get an American institution to sort of buy the land off of the French municipality and therefore save the building, figure out what to do with it after. At the end of the day, that didn't really happen just because of a lot of international, that takes a very long time. And also it didn't really need to happen because you have Andre Malraux and Alfred Roth, who Andre is the person who created the Ministry of Culture for France in 49, but I'm not positive. And he created it to do exactly this, to save buildings. And then Alfred Roth, who is one of Le Corbusier's disciples and friends, was the person who recommended that the Villa Savoye should be added into should be protected as a historical monument, and it became the first modern building to be labeled as historical. And it was protected after that, and it was restored and is now part of a museum with a couple other buildings on the estate.
Fantastic. Great. I'm sorry, I should have caught you before you close that out. Do you mind opening it again? Thank you for that very rich introduction to the Villa Savoye. Great. Will you go to your very first image of it, or actually the one that has the, yep, that one.
Okay.
Yeah. So you did an excellent job talking us through this. First, for the rest of you, like, what is your impression of this building? Like it? Don't like it?
I like it a lot.
Okay, tell me what you like about it.
Like, if I made it big time famous out in Cali, I would want that as like my place. Looks like pretty cool.
Nice. Okay, good. What appeals to you about it?
It's like hip, kind of sexy, modern.
Exactly. And modernist buildings are always shown that way. They're either in movies like the villain lives in a modernist building, or they're like super chic, sexy spots, right? Okay. In terms of our thinking of architectural history, the reason the Villa Savoye is the icon that it is, if you look over here at the image of the right, on the right, the very bottom drawing, where we can see all of the pilotis, or you can also just think of them as stilts. We know them as posts, right, from a post and lintel construction. The idea there replicates early Greek temples, right, with this very important columned structural post and lintel action. And then that basement, that bottom, or that first level meant for the car, as Luke explained so well for us, it's painted green so that when you stand back and look at the house, what's the impression that you're going to get? Why is this setup important? For someone who hates ornament, what's with the green paint? Anybody? So the house is supposed to look like it's floating. The idea, this arc from ancient Rome all the way up through Romanesque and Gothic, right? The idea that the building would get lighter and lighter and lighter is to have reached its pinnacle here, where the building is so light, theoretically, right, that it can stand up on stilts. Now he's hiding that understructure, he's hiding what's happening under there, but even that first floor, that floor with the car, that's not doing the structural work. Again, it's those columns, those Greek temple columns that have now become thinner, lighter, stronger because they're steel, and they're letting the building float. He's defying gravity is the visual idea, right? That architecture has come so far, and architects have such a mastery over nature that they can defy gravity. That free floating facade is what we were talking about in terms of the skin on the building. It doesn't hold anything. It's just a skin. It's just a seal around the building. It doesn't do any structural work. It's free hanging. And then Luke described so well the importance of those windows, which again, from the inside, if you're standing inside and you are Le Corbusier's height, because as we talked about before, he's obsessed with this idea of the modular, which is based on his height, you have a panoramic view. If you're shorter, taller, it's not going to work out for you, but you're not his ideal. So this building really, as Luke said, just incarnates everything about what Le Corbusier and then after the fact, most of the international style architects were aiming for. Okay, thank you, Luke. Do you mind closing that out? And we will move. Oh, Alex, I'm sorry. We've got 2 minutes left. Do you want to do it today? Do you want to wait?
I can do it today.
Okay, fantastic. For those of you who can stay, please do. For those of you who have a next class, of course, you're free to go, but hang in there for your colleague. All right.
Let me share my screen. Okay, you all can see it.
Great.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the Barcelona Pavilion. It was originally not the Barcelona Pavilion, it was the German Pavilion for the 1929 International Exposition, which was held in Barcelona. And kind of like we talked about at the beginning of today's class, the modernist movement kind of wanted to unify people during this post-World War I era, and it was right before World War II, so it was that in-between phase. So this World Fair, which was the second one ever, the first one happened in the late 1800s, and the second one occurred in the late 1920s, of course, before World War II. But 20 European nations participated in this fair, and the Barcelona German Pavilion in this instance was used to host King Alfonso XIII, who was the King of Spain, and German officials during the inauguration of the exposition. So the German Pavilion was designed by Ludwig Mies van der Hoorn and Lily Reich, and it's a series of interconnected spaces through different walls and like a grid system. And Mies designed the pavilion as a building itself and not as a house of art or sculpture, which is important because the modernist interpretation kind of lends itself to be seen as an architectural phenomenon in and of itself. And the pavilion was meant to be a place for tranquility and escape from the exposition. And as such, as an inhabitable sculpture itself, the location was very important, and Mies decided the location himself, and he preferred a like more quiet space. And if you've ever been to Barcelona, you know it's like one of the most busy cities in all of Europe. There's a specific street, the Ramblas, which is super hectic and like always full of people 24/7. So it's interesting to see how the German Pavilion was quietly tucked away from that city center. So yeah, the actual German Pavilion was dismantled in 1930 after the exposition, and the materials were sold to make up for the initial investment due to Germany's deteriorating economy, which probably was reason for World War II as well. But the site was empty for 50 years. But in the early 1980s, Catalonian architects rebuilt the pavilion from very limited information, yet they recreated a very correct interpretation of it. And it's very interesting because most of their designs were based off of limited drawings and black and white photos, but they replicated the pavilion to be what it is today. And it's still in the same location, which is in a very decentralized park in Barcelona. So it's very interesting to see how it maintains that modernist appeal. So speaking of modernist appeal, this pavilion gives me a very calming aura. It's kind of like if you were in a spa or something, or a place where one looks out and tries to be one with the environment. It reminds me a lot of Miami, which is where I'm from. So I imagine kind of like a house on Star Island, which is a very exclusive island by all the cruise ships in Miami, where a lot of celebrities live, where I just like imagine a super famous person walking out in their bathrobe, just going out to their backyard and looking at the very beautiful scenic ocean. And it's just a very scenic environment. And I think this kind of demonstrates how important this building was for inspiring the modernist movements. And the details are very simple and minimal, but the details are so unique that you have to really appreciate the details to fully understand what's at play and what's at work. So I think an important part of this is the materials through which the pavilion is made out of. There's a shift from various natural and man-made materials. There's glass through the windows, steel, or different kinds of stone like Roman travertine, African onyx, green alpine marble, and different types of marble. And interestingly enough, in the original pavilion, I don't believe they recreated this, but in the original pavilion, the colors of the marble were meant to represent the German flag through like black, red, and goldish yellow. And the other materials of steel, chrome, and glass are representative of the man-made materials. And kind of like we were talking about in this last TED Talk, there's 8 slender columns that allow for the roof to float while freeing up the interior for an open plan, which creates that low profile that kind of feels in that floating sense. And the low roof projects out over the exterior, which is also very interesting architecture-wise because it blurs the spatial demarcation between interior and exterior. So they kind of become one and the same, depending upon where one is walking. And this building as well uses a low stature, which kind of narrows the visitor's line of vision, forcing one to adjust themselves to the view that the architect Mies wanted to. Yet at the same time, the low roof plane encourages movement, which is kind of what the architect wanted visitors to do. And the movement through the pavilion sets you in a process of discovery and rediscovery, offering new perspectives, even though like through every new walk, inside and outside, since they do become blurred and they become one and the same. Another very important phenomenon that comes out of the German pavilion is the Barcelona pavilion is the Barcelona chair, which reminds me a lot of Miami as well through its like modern and simple yet elegant and grandiose claims. And it's supported on each side by 2 chrome-plated flat steel bars, handcrafted minimal steel frame with ivory-colored leather. And it was actually designed for royalty to oversee the opening of the pavilion. And one of the quotes from the architect was, "The government was to receive a king. The chair had to be monumental. In those circumstances, you just couldn't use a kitchen chair," which I think is kind of funny to consider how deliberate they were in planning this. And it's very interesting as well because these chairs are still manufactured and produced today. And when I first saw it, it did look familiar. So I think a lot of modernist interpretations in new homes still utilize some of the facets that the original pavilion did. So finally, the sculpture that you can see in the back is a bronze reproduction of the original piece entitled Dawn. It was kind of, I found mixed research for the sculpture being called Dawn and Morning, but either way, it's a naked woman who has her arms raised, protecting herself from the sunrise, which I think kind of resembles how one can be embedded outside and inside of the pavilion. And the lines are blurred, but the sculpture is indicative of the tranquil nature of the environment and being out in the open and exposed, which kind of is indicative of what the architect wanted. And it's placed at the end of a small pond, and the sculpture is reflected not only through the actual representation of it, but the water in the pond that it's in and the marble and the glass kind of multiply the presence of the sculpture, which kind of exposes the sculpture to its visitors. And the original sculpture from the 1920s was returned in 1930 after the demolition. But in the 1980s, they recreated the sculpture and produced it, which I think just kind of captures the whole modernist interpretation that this pavilion seeks to evoke. And the fact that a lot of visitors go here, I think kind of speaks to wonders about how it can just be a nice relaxation from the super crowded Barcelona culture and that sense of lifestyle, which I think is super important when one kind of leaves the city and goes out to this area.
All right, thank you so much. That was a great overview of what's happening there. Just to think for a minute, and really just 1 minute, because I know you're all hanging on, about what happens between Le Corbusier and Mies. By the time we get to Mies, you have a richness in the materials that Alex explained so well, right? All of the marble, the stone, that in Le Corbusier is super functional. Most of his materials are largely inexpensive. They're very functionalist, where Mies really takes the international style onto a new and different plane of richer, more luxurious level of things. Okay, thank you so much for your patience. I still have part of the lecture that I'm going to record and post for you, so you get the rest of it before, because you'll need it for the exam. But well done today for the presentations, and I will see you, no, I won't see you next week. Next week you have an urban analysis. Let me know if you have any questions on how that's going to roll out, but you're just analyzing a city where before you had analyzed a particular building. The instructions should be pretty clear on that. And I look forward to reading what you put together. Have a great holiday, and then I'll see you on Zoom on the other side of that.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.